$3. That's what she paid for a place 4 families had already buried. I've kept a ledger every day of my life. Rain, cattle, the price of feed, the men who owe me and the men I owe. So I can tell you the exact figure the whole Rincon Valley laughed at that morning on the courthouse steps. $3 for the Vane homestead, where the well was dead, the roof was gone, and the spring had been sealed under stone for 20 years by a man too bitter to let anything live after him. They laughed because they were sure of what they knew. But there was a thing under that ground that none of them knew. A thing an old Apache man had carried in his memory his whole life, waiting for someone with the sense to ask. And when the drought came down on us like a slow fist, and the wells went to dust one by one, that ruined little homestead did something that stopped the laughing cold. This is the story of what she bought and what it cost. The gavel came down, and a woman I'd never seen bought the deadest piece of ground in 3 counties for the price of a sack of flour, and the men around me laughed like she'd told the funniest joke in the world. I didn't laugh. I don't remember deciding not to. I just stood there on the courthouse steps with my hat in my hands and my ledger under my arm. I carried it everywhere that year, the way a nervous man carries worry beads, and I watched her. She was maybe 30, 32, hard to say. The drought aged everybody. She was thin the way a fence post is thin, all straight lines and no give, and her dress had been washed so many times the color had given up and gone to the gray of creek water. She held a little cloth purse with both hands. When the auctioneer said sold, she didn't smile. She just closed her eyes for a second, like a person does at the end of a long prayer, and then she opened them and looked at the men laughing, and she did not look away. That's the first thing I wrote about Della Marsh in my ledger that night. Not her name, I didn't know it yet. I wrote she didn't look away. Harlan Prout laughed the loudest. He always did. Prout ran 900 head on the flats east of town and figured that made him something close to God's foreman in the Rincon. He had a big soft laugh that he used like a whip. $3, he kept saying, wiping his eyes. $3 for a grave with a fence around it. Somebody tell that woman the Vane place ain't had water since Hoover was a boy. Somebody tell her about the roof, said the fellow next to him. Somebody tell her about the ghost, said another, and they all howled again. I want to be honest since I'm setting this down. I didn't think she was brave. I thought she was a fool. I'd farmed and ranched the Rincon for 41 years, and I knew that ground the way you know a bad tooth. The Vane place sat up against the red rock at the north end of the valley, and Elgin Vane had wrung the last living thing out of it before he died, and then he'd done worse than that. But I'll get to what Vane did. It took me a long time to understand it, and I'd rather you understand it the way I did, slow and too late to be proud of. The county clerk, a soft-handed man named Foss, had her sign the papers on the hood of his automobile. I edged close enough to hear because I'm a nosy old man and I don't apologize for it. She wrote her name in a careful schoolteacher hand. Della Marsh. Foss asked her, not unkind, whether she understood there was no water on the property. There's a spring on the Platte, she said. Her voice was low and even, and it surprised me because from the look of her I'd expected something thinner. There was a spring, Foss said. It's sealed. Vane capped it. There's nothing there but rock and rattlesnakes, ma'am. I'd feel poorly if I didn't say so. You've said so. She folded her copy of the deed into a square and put it in the cloth purse like it was money. Thank you. Prout had wandered over by then, still grinning, thumbs in his belt. Ma'am, I'll do you a kindness the county won't. I'll take that deed off your hands for $5. Clean profit. You go on back wherever you came from with your head up. She looked at his outstretched hand a long moment. Then she looked up at his face, and I saw something move behind her eyes that wasn't fear and wasn't hope. It was closer to spite, and I confess it warmed me toward her a little, because spite is at least alive. You laughed at $3, she said. You'll pay a good deal more than $5 before this is done. She didn't say it hot. She said it the way you'd note down a coming change in the weather. Then she walked off toward the livery, and Prout's grin curdled just slightly at the corners, and I opened my ledger right there and wrote the line down before I forgot it, because I've learned that the true things people say get lost fastest. My name is Wes Cutter. I'm the one telling you this, so you ought to know what kind of man is holding the pen. I ran a small outfit south of the Marsh place, 300 acres of my own and grazing rights on the state land beyond. My wife Ada had been 2 years gone by then. We never had children that lived. I kept the ledger the way some men keep a dog, for the company of it, And by that summer of the drought, I was writing more about the sky than the cattle, because the sky was where the trouble lived. We hadn't had rain worth the name in 14 months. The Rincon Creek, which had run my whole life, had gone to a chain of green puddles and then to a chain of dry stones. Men were selling stock at robbery prices or watching it die in the wash. Every windmill in the valley creaked all day and pulled up sand. You'd wake in the night to that creaking and lie there doing arithmetic that never came out right. So you'll understand that when a strange woman bought a dead homestead for $3, it was the best entertainment we'd had in a year of funerals. It gave the men something to laugh at that wasn't themselves. I didn't go up to her place for near a month. I told myself I was busy, and I was, hauling water to my own thirsty cattle in barrels like a fool. But the truth is I didn't want to watch her fail. There's a particular cruelty in watching a person work hard at a thing that's already lost, and I'd had my fill of it that year. What finally took me up the North Road was a dog. Old Man Cheese dog, to be exact, though I didn't know it was cheese yet. It was a yellow, rangy thing with a torn ear that had taken to trotting down to my place at dusk. And one evening it wouldn't leave, just sat at the edge of my yard and looked north and whined low, like it was trying to tell me something, and had run out of patience with how stupid I was. I finally saddled up mostly to follow it home and be shut of it. It led me up the North Road, past the Red Rock, to the Vane place. To the Marsh place, I should say, and I sat my horse at the broken gate and I did not believe what I was looking at. You have to understand what I expected. I expected the ruin I'd known for 20 years, the sagging house with its ribs of rafters open to the sky, the yard gone to hardpan and cactus, the old fields cracked like a dry palm. And most of that was still there. The house was still a wreck. She'd hung a piece of canvas over one corner of the roof and was living under it like a bird in a burnt tree. But the yard was different. Someone had cleared a square of ground maybe 40 feet on a side, cleared it of rock by hand. I could see the rocks stacked in a low wall along the edge. Hundreds of them, thousands, each one carried and set, and in that cleared square the earth was dark. Not green yet, just dark. Damp dark in the middle of the worst drought in living memory, on ground everyone in the valley knew for a certainty was dead. And kneeling in the middle of that dark square, with her sleeves rolled and her hands black to the wrist, was Della Marsh. And squatting on his heels beside her, unhurried as a stone, was an old Apache man I had seen maybe twice in 20 years, and had never once spoken to. The dog trotted past me and lay down in the shade of the rock wall like it owned the place, which I later learned it did. Della looked up. She had a smudge of mud across her cheekbone, and her hair had come loose, and she looked, for the first time since the courthouse, not hard at all. She looked tired down to the bone and fierce with it. "Mr. Cutter," she said. She knew my name. I found out later she'd made it her business to learn every name in the valley, who owed the bank, who'd buried whom, who I could trust and who I couldn't. She kept accounts, too, in her head, which is a more dangerous ledger than mine. "Ma'am," I said. I didn't know what else to say. I looked at the dark ground and then at the old man and then back at her. "You've come to see the joke," she said, not cruel, just naming it. "I've come," I said slowly, "because I can't figure how that ground is wet." The old man made a sound then. It took me a second to understand it was a laugh, a short, dry, huffing thing, more air than voice. He didn't look at me. He was looking at the ground the same way Della was, the way a man looks at a wound he's dressing. "He can't figure it," the old man said to the ground, to the dog, to nobody. 20 years he lives in this valley and he can't figure it." And he shook his head slow, and I felt my ears go hot, and I had no idea yet how much that old man had earned the right to say it. His name was Naldo Chi. Everyone in town just called him Chi when they called him anything, which was seldom. He lived alone in a little adobe up in the rocks north of the Marsh place. On the last thin corner of ground the government had let his people keep after they took the rest, and he'd outlived his wife and 2 of his 3 children and most of the men who'd wronged him, which he seemed to count as a kind of victory. He was old the way rock is old. He had a face like a dry creek bed, and eyes that missed nothing. I got down off my horse slow, because my knees were already going even then, and I walked over to the edge of the dark ground, and Della let me look. There was water in it, not much. But if you scraped down a few inches with your fingers the way she showed me, the soil came up cool and dark and glistening, and there was the smell of it, that mineral whetstone smell that I hadn't smelled anywhere in the valley in over a year. It went through me like a drink of it would have. I'm not ashamed to say my eyes stung. How, I said. It wasn't even a question. It was just the word by itself. The spring's not dead, Della said. She sat back on her heels and pushed her hair out of her face with the back of her wrist. Vane didn't kill it. You can't kill it. He just... She looked at Chi. He hid it, Chi said. He put stone on its mouth so no one would drink. So it would die for want of somebody to want it. He picked up a clod of the dark earth and crumbled it between his fingers, watching it fall. But water doesn't die of that. Water waits. It went sideways under the rock, and it has been coming up here a little in this low place for 20 years, and no one had the sense to dig where it was soft. He tipped his chin at Della, and for the first time something in his old face gentled. She dug where it was soft. I need to tell you what I understood at that gate, and what I didn't, because the difference is the whole story. What I understood was small and practical, and it was enough to change my breathing. There was water on the marsh place, living water, in a drought that was killing the Rinkin. What I did not understand, what it took me the rest of that terrible summer to understand, and what I would give a great deal now to have understood sooner, was that this was not luck, and it was not a miracle, and it was not, whatever Prout would later scream on those same courthouse steps, a thing she had stolen. It was a thing that had been known for longer than there'd been a valley called the Rinkin or a county to auction it off. The seep at the north end, up against the red rock, Chi's people had known it before Elgin Vane's grandfather ever drove a stake, before there was a courthouse to laugh on. They had a name for it that Chi would not say to me that first day, and did not say to me for a long time, and when he finally did say it, he said it quietly, and I will not write it here, because it was his to give and not mine to sell. What Vane had done, the thing I said I'd get to, was this. Elgin Vane had bought the homestead knowing the water was there, because Chi's father had shown him, trusting him the way you trust a neighbor. And when Chi's father asked, later in a hard winter, to water a few horses at the seep his own people had drunk from for 200 years, Elgin Vane had run him off at gunpoint. And then, so it could never be asked of him again, so he'd never have to look at an old Apache man at his gate and feel what a smaller man feels when he's done a shameful thing. Elgin Vane had dynamited the spring's mouth and rolled stone over it, and let the whole valley believe the water was dead. He'd rather kill the water than share it. That's the kind of man he was, and he died in that house alone, and the valley called it a shame the place had gone dry, and nobody but an old Apache man remembered that it hadn't gone dry at all. It had been murdered, and it had refused to stay dead. Della Marsh had paid $3 for a murdered spring, and an old man who remembered where the body was buried had come down out of the rocks to help her dig it up. "Why are you helping her?" I asked Chi. I asked it badly. I've thought since that it was the wrong question, or asked in the wrong spirit, because it assumed helping her needed a reason beyond the plain human one. Chi looked at me a long time. The dog thumped its tail in the dust. "Because she asked me," he said finally. "In 20 years, she is the first one who came up to my door and asked me a question about this valley instead of telling me a thing about it." He turned back to the ground. "And because I am old and I would like to see it drink again before I die, a man is allowed to want that." Della had gone still, listening, and I saw her reach over without a word and rest her muddy hand for a moment on the old man's shoulder, light, quick, gone again, the way you touch a thing to be sure it's real. He let her. Neither of them looked at the other. Some things are too large to look at directly. I got back on my horse. I didn't know what to say, so I said the true thing, which is a habit that's cost me and saved me in about equal measure. "They're going to come for it," I said. "When the wells go, Prout and the rest, when they figure out you've got water and they don't, they're going to come, and it won't be to laugh." Della stood up, slow, her hand on the small of her back, the way a person stands who's been kneeling a long time. She looked out over the low rock wall, over her dark square of ground, down the north road toward the town that had laughed at her, and she was quiet for a while. "I know," she said. And then she said a thing I wrote in my ledger that night word for word, and underlined, and have never crossed out. "Mr. Cutter, when they come, and you're right, they'll come, I'm going to have to decide something, whether this water is mine because I paid $3 and dug where it was soft." She looked at Chi, who was watching the ground, who had watched the ground his whole life. "Or whether it was never mine at all, and I'm just the fool the valley left holding it, right when it mattered most who was holding it." The dog sat up. Far off on my own place, I could hear my windmill creaking, pulling up sand. The heat that August was a thing you could hear. I'd never have believed it if I hadn't lived it, but that's how it was. The days got so still and so hot that the silence had a sound. A high, thin ringing under everything, and you'd catch yourself standing in the middle of a chore you'd stopped doing, just listening to the world go quiet the way a sick animal goes quiet. The cattle stopped bawling. That was the worst of it. When cattle are thirsty, they bawl, and when they stop bawling, it means they've given up, and all up and down the Rincon that August the cattle stopped bawling. I hauled water in barrels from a friend's stock tank 12 miles off until his tank went dry too. Then I did what half the valley did. I went up the North Road, hat in my hands, to the woman we'd laughed at. I wasn't the first. By then a kind of quiet traffic had started up that road, a rancher's wife with 2 jugs, a Mexican family from the section houses with a milk can in a barrow, the widow Alvarez leading a burro. Della never turned a soul away that summer. She'd have them fill what they'd brought at the trough she had laid, for they'd built a proper thing by then, dug the seep out and cased it in stone and run a wood trough off it. And the water came up cold and steady, not a flood but faithful, a gallon or 2 a minute, which in that valley in that August was the difference between the living and the dead. She took no money. I watched her refuse it more than once. But she took work, an hour's work for a jug, a half day for a barrel. She had rocks to move and a roof to raise and fields to bring back, and she was one woman with the frame of a fence post, so she banked the valley's need and paid it out in labor, and by the end of August that ruined homestead had more hands on it than any spread in the Rincon. It was the shrewdest thing I ever watched a person do, and I don't think she planned a lick of it. I think she was just too proud to take charity and too kind to refuse the thirsty, and the answer she found in between those 2 things was to make us all belong to the place a little. You can't laugh at a thing you've bled for. By September, there wasn't a family in the valley that hadn't set a stone in Della Marsh's wall. She was there every day. He and Della had worked out a way of being together that didn't need much talk. He'd show her a thing, how to lay the trough so the water didn't foul, which of the old fields would come back and which were salt-truant for good, where to plant the beans so the morning shade would carry them, and she'd do it. And he'd watch her do it and grunt, and that grunt was the whole of his approval, and she took it like gold. I asked her once, hauling rock alongside her because I'd gotten shamed into working for my water like everybody else, why she trusted the old man so completely. A stranger. She'd known him a season. She straightened up with a rock in her arms. She'd gotten stronger, I noticed, the fence post thinness gone to something more like rawhide, and she thought about it honestly, which was her way. She never gave you the easy answer if the true one was standing right there. When I came out here, she said, I'd buried a husband and a farm and a child in that order in 18 months. She said it flat. I hadn't known about the child. I don't think anyone in the valley knew about the child. I had $9 and a deed to a dead place, and every soul I met told me a thing. The clerk told me it was hopeless. Prout told me to sell. You, she looked at me, not unkind. You thought I was a fool. Don't tell me you didn't. I could see it on you at the gate. I didn't argue. It was true. And I walked up into those rocks to that old man's door, she said, because somebody in town had said the only one who'd know about the water is that old Indian, and he won't tell you anything. And I knocked, and he opened the door, and I said I didn't tell him a thing. I was so tired of being told things. I just asked him. I said, is the water dead? She set her rock on the wall, careful, fitting it. And he looked at me for the longest time, and then he said, no, it's only waiting. And Mr. Cutter, I hadn't heard a hopeful word out of a single mouth in 18 months, and here it came out of the one man everybody said would give me nothing. She wiped her hands on her skirt. So I trusted him. Because he was the only one who told me the truth was better than it looked instead of worse. I've turned that over a lot of times since. The truth was better than it looked. There's not many will tell you that. It takes a certain kind of courage to say a hopeful thing, because if you're wrong, you look a fool, and most folks would rather be a safe pessimist than a hopeful fool. Chi had risked being a fool for a stranger at his door. I don't know if I'd have had the nerve. The trouble came the way trouble does, sideways and wearing a friendly face. It was Prout, of course. Harlan Prout's wells had held longer than most because he had money to sink them deeper. But by mid-September, even his deep wells were sucking mud, and 900 head is a great deal of thirst. He drove his automobile up the North Road one evening with the banker, Sewell, riding beside him, and I happened to be there filling barrels, and so I saw the whole thing. Prout didn't laugh this time. That was the first sign, and it turned my stomach cold. He took his hat off. He called her Mrs. Marsh, respectful. He stood at her rock wall and admired her fields. She had beans up by then, and a stand of corn, green as a wound in all that brown, and he said he'd come to make her a fair offer, neighbor to neighbor, in a hard time. He wanted to buy the water rights. Not the land, she could keep her little house, he said generously, just the spring. He'd pay well, he said, a good deal more than $3, and he laughed a little at his own joke, and it fell dead in the still air because nobody laughed with him. Della listened to all of it with her arms folded. Chi was up on the roof frame, sitting still as a hawk, watching, saying nothing. The banker Sewell had papers. "And the folks who come here for water?" Della asked when Prout was done. "The Alvarez family, the section houses, Widow Ray's, when you own the spring, do they still drink?" Prout spread his hands, reasonable. "I'd run it as a business, Mrs. Marsh, fair rates. A man can't give water away in a drought, that's just—" "They can't pay rates?" Her voice hadn't risen. "They can barely pay and work, and you don't need their work, you need their water gone so there's more for your cattle. If you owned this spring, half the families in this valley would be dry inside a week." She said it as a plain fact, the way you'd read it off a ledger. "You know that, that's the offer. You're offering to buy the valley's water so you don't have to share it. Same as Vane." The name landed. I saw it land. Prout's face did something complicated. "Vane was a fool who let good water die," Prout said, tight now. "I'd put it to use. For 900 head and to hell with everybody else." Della unfolded her arms. "No." Sewell the banker cleared his throat then, and here's where the friendly face slipped, and I understood they'd come loaded for exactly this answer. Sewell said, mild as milk, that Mrs. Marsh should perhaps consider her position. That there was a question, nothing certain, mind, but a question, about the validity of a tax sale of a property with, encumbrances. That water rights in this state were a complicated matter, older than deeds. That an old prior claim, if one existed, if say some party had held rights to that seat before the homestead was ever patented, might cloud her title considerably. And a clouded title, Sewell said sadly, was a hard thing to defend for a woman of limited means, in a court that cost money to enter. He was threatening her, gently in banker's clothes. He was saying, we can tie your dead husband's spring up in a lawsuit you can't afford, and while it's tied up nobody drinks, and you'll settle out of thirst. And here is the terrible, beautiful part, the part I've never gotten to the bottom of. Because Sewell, in his cleverness, had reached for the one weapon he thought would frighten her, an old prior claim. And he had no idea, none, that the old prior claim was sitting on the roof framed 10 feet over his head with his arms around his knees, and that it was real. Chi's people had held that water before there was a patent, before there was a Vane. The prior claim Sewell was inventing to scare a widow actually existed, and it belonged to the old man he'd have driven past on the road without a glance. I watched Della understand it. I watched the whole shape of it come into her face, the trap Sewell thought he was setting, and the truth underneath it that was so much larger and stranger than Sewell's little lie. She looked up at Chi. Chi looked down at her, and something passed between them that I will not pretend I fully understood, but that I felt in the roots of my teeth, the way you feel a train before you hear it. They left, Prout and Sewell. Prout put his hat back on at the gate, which meant the friendliness was formally over, and he said one thing before he drove off, quiet just to Della, but I heard it. "You've got maybe a month before every man in this valley is thirsty enough to stop caring how it looks," he said. "When that day comes, Mrs. Marsh, you'll wish you'd sold to me while selling was still your idea." Then the automobile ground off down the north road in a rooster tail of dust, and the dust hung in the still air a long time, the way everything hung in the air that summer, refusing to settle. Della sat down on her rock wall. She looked emptied out. Chi climbed down off the roof frame, slow, careful, an old man's care, and he came and sat beside her, not touching, the two of them looking down the road where the dust still hung. "He was lying," Della said. "Sewell, about the old claim, he made it up to scare me." She turned her head and looked at the old man. "But it's not made up, is it?" Chi was quiet a long while. The light was going gold and then red over the rocks. Somewhere the yellow dog was barking at nothing, the way it did at dusk. "My grandfather watered horses there," Chi said finally. "His grandfather, too. There was no paper, there was no court. There was the water, and there were the people who knew it, and that was the deed, and it was a good deed, and it held for 200 years until a man with a different kind of paper came and said the water was his because the paper said so." He picked up a pebble, turned it in his fingers. "Sewell thinks a prior claim is a thing you take to a court. He doesn't know he's sitting on the real one. He doesn't know the real one can't go to his court, because his court would laugh it out the door, an old Apache man, no paper, saying my people drank here. He set the pebble down. So it's true and it's worth nothing, both at once. That's the joke they've played on us for 100 years, and it's such an old joke I've stopped feeling it mostly. Della didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, it's worth everything. Fierce low. It's worth everything, and I'll tell you why. Because they think this water is mine, a stranger's, a widow's, a fool's who paid $3, and they think they can pry it out of my hands with a lawsuit and a hard month. And maybe they can. She stood up. But if it isn't mine, if it's yours, if it was always yours, then the thing they're trying to steal isn't a widow's lucky spring. It's a 200-year-old claim, and the whole valley's been drinking off it all summer, off the mercy of the people you all pushed into the rocks. And when that comes out, she stopped. Chi was looking at her with something I'd never seen on his face. It might have been fear, it might have been hope. On an old face they can look the same. When that comes out, Della said slowly, working it out as she said it the way she did, it stops being a fight over one widow's water. It becomes a fight the whole valley has to look at. Everyone who filled a jug here this summer, everyone who set a stone in that wall, they'll have to decide whose water they've been drinking. And that Chi, that's a thing even Prout's money can't buy quiet. The old man stared at her. You'd tell them, he said, it wasn't quite a question. You'd stand up in that town that laughed at you, and instead of saving yourself, instead of just saying the water's mine, I paid for it, come drink and be grateful, you'd stand up and say the water was never mine. It's his, ask him. He shook his head slow. You'd give away the one thing that's keeping you safe. Della looked down the north road. The dust had finally settled. The first star was out over the red rock, low and steady. I don't know yet, she said. God help me, Chi, I don't know yet what I'm going to do. She wrapped her arms around herself, though it wasn't cold. I buried everything I had before I came here. This place is all I've got left in the world. And you're asking me if I'll risk it to tell a truth the valley doesn't want to hear, for a claim that won't even hold up in their court. Her voice broke, just a little, just at the edge. I don't know if I'm that good a person. I want to be. I don't know if I am. And the old man reached over then, the first time I ever saw him touch her, and he put his hand over her clasped hands, the way she'd touched his shoulder that first day, quick and light and gone. Nobody knows if they're that good a person, Chi said, until the day they have to be. The day she had to be came in October, and it came the way Prout had promised, with the whole valley thirsty enough to stop caring how it looked. The last of the deep wells went the second week of October. Prout's went. And a thirsty valley is a different animal from a laughing one. The quiet traffic up the north road stopped being quiet. It became a crowd. Men who'd have died before asking a strange woman for anything now stood 3 deep at Della's rock wall with their hats in their hands and their eyes ugly with fear. And fear in a crowd of men turns to anger faster than water turns to steam. I was there. I'd taken to spending most of my days up at the marsh place by then, telling myself it was for the water, knowing it was because I couldn't stand to be anywhere else when whatever was coming came. My own cattle were mostly sold or dead. My ledger that October has almost nothing about cattle in it. It's all about her. Prout came at the head of the crowd and Sewell beside him with his papers, and this time Prout had done his arithmetic. He didn't ask to buy, he announced. He stood up on the bed of a wagon so they could all see him. And he told the thirsty valley that the Widow Marsh was sitting on the only water for 40 miles, and rationing it out by the jug on her own say-so, and that a resource that meant life or death for the whole Rincon couldn't be left in the hands of one woman and an old Indian on the strength of a $3 tax sale, that he nodded to Sewell, the bank had reason to believe wasn't even legal. She'll tell you it's hers, Prout shouted. Paid $3, dug a hole, and now she'll parcel out your children's water at her pleasure. Well, I say water like this belongs to the valley, to all of us. And I've got the means to run it fair, and I've got a claim the courts will honor, and this woman's got a clouded deed and a good story. So I'll ask her plain in front of all of you. He turned to Della, who stood on her own rock wall to face him, small and straight, the setting sun behind her. Whose water is this, Mrs. Marsh? Yours that you'll dole out on a whim, or the valley's mine to run for everybody? It was a clever trap. I saw grown men in that crowd nodding. He'd made it a choice between a stranger's private say-so and a rich man's public order, and in a thirsty crowd that's not much of a choice at all. If she said mine, she was a hoarder. If she said the valley's, she'd handed it to Prout. He'd left her no third door. And Della Marsh stood on her wall in the red light with the whole valley waiting. the valley that had laughed at her in the spring and needed her in the fall, and I watched her make the decision she'd told me she didn't know if she was good enough to make. She found the third door. She'd been standing in front of it all along. "It's not mine," she said. The crowd went quiet. Prute's face began slowly to open into a grin because he thought she was folding. "It's not mine," Della said again, louder so it carried to the back. "Harlan Prute's right about that, at least. I paid $3 for a house and some dead fields. I never paid a cent for this water because this water was never Elgin Vane's to sell to the county, and it was never the county's to sell to me." She turned, slow, and she pointed up the slope to where old Naldo Chi stood by the trough his own hands had built, in front of the water his own grandfather had watered horses at. "It's his. It's been his people's since before there was a Rincon or a valley or a name for any of it. Ask him whose water this is. He's been standing right here all summer." "Not one of you ever asked?" You could have heard a stone drop. Prute's grin died. Sewell went white because Sewell of all of them understood. He'd invented an old prior claim to frighten her, and she'd just told the whole valley it was real, and that he'd known, and that the water they'd all been drinking on her mercy since August had never been the widow's mercy at all. It had been cheese. That's an old Indian with no paper," Sewell sputtered. "There's no legal." "I know there's no paper," Della's voice cracked across the crowd like a whip. "That's the whole rotten heart of it, isn't it? You made the courts and then you made sure his people could never win in them. You took the land and burned the deed and then you said, 'Show me your deed.'" She was shaking now, but she didn't stop. "Well, I'm showing you mine. I've got the only paper anybody in this valley respects, a deed from your own courthouse, and I'm standing here telling all of you it's worthless because the water under it belongs to a man your law won't let hold it. So now you've got a choice, not me, you." She swept her arm across the whole thirsty crowd. "Every one of you drank here this summer. Every one of you set a stone in this wall. You did it as neighbors, and he let you, and I let you, and nobody asked whose it was because it was easier not to. Well, now you know it's cheese, and the question isn't whether the court will honor that. The court won't. We all know the court won't. The question is whether you will. Whether this valley will drink off an old man's mercy all summer, and then stand by while a rich man and a banker take his water with a lie about a claim they know good and well is real." Nobody moved. The sun was almost down. The trough ran, faint and steady, the only sound. "I can't make you honor it," Della said, quieter now, spent. "There's no law that'll make you. There's only whether you can look him in the face after. That's all I've got. That's the whole of what I can do. I paid $3 for the one place in this valley where the truth was buried, and I dug it up, and now it's lying here in front of all of you, and I'm done carrying it alone." She stepped down off the wall. "Somebody get the man a chair. He's 80 years old, and he stood the whole time you talked over his head. I have thought about what happened next for the rest of my life, and I still can't tell it in a way that does it justice, so I'll just tell it plain. It was the widow Alvarez who moved first, a little woman section house poor who'd hauled water up that rode all summer for her grandchildren. She walked up out of the crowd, past Prute on his wagon up the slope to where Chi stood, and she stopped in front of the old man and she said something to him too quiet for me to hear, and then she bent and an old woman, her knees bad as mine, she set a stone. A new stone on the wall in front of him. A stone for the man, not the water. Then the Ray's boy did it. Then a rancher named Cold that I'd never have guessed. Then 3 of the section house men, and the school teacher, and my neighbor Alvy who owed the bank more than his place was worth. One at a time, out of that thirsty crowd, they walked up the slope past Harlan Prute, and they set a stone in front of Naldo Chi, and it wasn't a law, and it wasn't a court, and it wouldn't have held up in front of Sewell's judge for 1 minute. But it was the whole valley, one at a time, deciding out loud whose water they'd been drinking. Deciding they could not look the old man in the face and pretend otherwise. Prute stood on his wagon and watched his valley walk past him. He didn't shout. There wasn't anything left to shout. You can't outbid a thing like that. It isn't for sale. After a while, he got down off the wagon, quiet, and he and Sewell drove off down the north road, and the dust hung in the air behind them the way it always did, and this time nobody watched it settle. They were all looking up the slope at the old man. Chi didn't say anything. I don't think he could. He stood there in front of his water while the valley built him a wall he'd needed for 100 years, and at some point I saw Della go and stand beside him, not touching, the 2 of them just standing, and the yellow dog got up and leaned against the old man's leg, and that was all. It didn't fix everything. I want to be honest, because Della taught me that the truth is usually better than it looks and harder than they tell you, both at once. The court never did honor Chi's claim. Della was right about that. It never had a prayer. The deed stayed in her name because the law would only let it stay in hers. But she made a paper of her own, a plain one, witnessed by half the valley, that said the water was cheese to say over as long as he lived and his family's after, and that she was only its keeper. And while a paper like that wouldn't have stopped a determined man in a court, no man in the Rincon was ever fool enough to try, because he'd have had to do it in front of a valley that had set the stones with its own hands and remembered doing it. The rains came back the next spring the way they always eventually do, and the wells filled, and after a while some folks went back to pretending they'd never stood 3 deep at a widow's wall begging. People are like that. But some didn't pretend. And the trough ran, and Cheese family watered there, and the Alvarez grandchildren, and anyone who came up the North Road and asked. Della was firm on the asking always to the end of her days. You asked. You didn't tell the valley a thing about its water. You went up and you asked the old man, or after he was gone you asked his granddaughter, and the answer was always yes. But the asking was the whole of it. The asking was the deed. She lived 4 more years. He's buried up in the rocks by his adobe next to his wife. And Della's buried down below on the homestead she paid $3 for. And I'm the last one left who was there at the wall, which is why I've set it all down, so it doesn't go the way most true things go. They laughed at her for buying a ruined homestead for $3. They stopped laughing when the wells went dry. But that's not the thing that shocked the valley, not really, whatever they say in town now. Water in a drought will get your attention, sure, but water's just water. The thing that shocked the valley, the thing none of them were ready for, the thing I've spent an old man's lifetime trying to understand, was that a broke widow with nothing left to lose could stand up in front of the town that laughed at her. On the one day she finally held the whip hand, and give the whole thing away to the man the valley had spent 100 years pretending not to see. I've kept a ledger every day of my life. Rain, cattle, debts, the price of feed. I've filled 40 of them.